Welcome to episode 8 of the history of BBC Micro typing games, my continuing review of games listings for the Beeb that were published in the many computing magazines of the 8-bit era. As well as trying to work out if it was ever actually worth the time it took to type these games in, I'll also try to highlight any interesting content from the magazines to help give a flavour of the state of computing at that time. In this episode, I'm continuing my journey through 1984 and I'll be looking at 4 magazines from March and April of that year, beginning with an issue of the Beeb magazine. This is actually one that our family had a physical copy of back in the day, and I still had it stored away until a few years ago when it fell victim to damp in the garage. The featured game is one that always intrigued me based on the graphic on the cover, but I never typed it in back then. Typically I browse these magazines on archive.org, but as the Beeb ones aren't generally available there, I found a new place to look at them, and that's the Centre for Computing History website. As always, I'll put a link to these magazines in the pinned comments so you can check them and other content out if you wish. Now, I've not looked at an issue of Beeb magazine since the second episode of this series, and I was looking at 1982 then, and it's fair to say that in the 2 years since then, it's come quite a long way. It now has a pretty vibrant colour cover, and the overall layout of the magazine is much more professional. In terms of the content, it's pretty similar to those earlier editions though, with a mixture of hardware and software reviews, utility programs, and of course a couple of games, which in this case includes the manhole game, which is what I'm going to be looking at. As I mentioned, I was always intrigued by this one based on the little image it shows on the front cover. Let's jump inside then and move straight to page 10, which has a report on Acorn's latest developments. This is all the information about what Acorn Soft's been up to as of March 1984, and begins with the Electron latest. Following the immediate success of the Electron, Acorn are finding it hard to ensure adequate deliveries of the assorted components required for the assembly of this micro, and as a result Electrons are in short supply, and it mentions that Acorn have issued out-of-stock posters for use in branches of W.H. Smith. The plus side though is that Acorn were working on a variety of add-ons for the Electron using the rear edge connector, and it mentions that a cartridge ROM socket is also planned. The rest of the article then updates on other developments by Acorn, including EcoNet, the Cambridge Ring, Winchester disk drives, and a variety of second processors including a 6502 and a Z80, all of which shows that Acorn were really pushing the various uses of their systems, everything from simple home micros to powerful business and industry machines. Moving on to page 20, and we see part 2 of a feature about machine code graphics, and this one continues obviously from the previous issue and covers mode 5 specifically, which it says is one of the modes most frequently used in commercially produced games. There's lots of detail given here that I'm obviously not going to go into, but the one thing that does stand out is this image that shows how to design and code a 4-colour character in mode 5. There are also a couple of small programs that show how to put these ideas into practice, so this would have been a nice article for anyone looking to program in machine code back then. Speaking of machine code and games, I've now moved on to page 32 where the latest software is reviewed, and this includes a review of Daredevil Dennis, which is one of my favourite games for the BBC Micro. Reviewer Alan Webster says the game has smooth, fast graphics and uses over 30 multicoloured sprite characters. It has an interrupt-driven sound routine so they have constant music while loading. There are also 6 skill levels to choose from, and each level has 6 intermediate levels, making 36 in all. He gives the game 3 out of 4 stars, saying the only reason he's given it 3 is due to a few minor programming bugs that occasionally spoil your enjoyment of the game. I don't think I remember any bugs myself, and it certainly didn't spoil my enjoyment. There's not much else of note that stood out in this magazine, so let's move on to the game listing, and this is the Manhole game, as I've already mentioned, and it says the Manhole game combines very good graphics and sound in a fast-moving game to test your reactions. You're the guardian of the catacombs below the streets of Cheltenham. Armed with only a single manhole cover, it's your job to prevent the populace from dropping through 4 holes in the road. And it then goes on to explain the controls, and it mentions that you've got 3 difficulty levels to choose from, with level 3 being not for the faint of heart. To the right of that introductory paragraph you also get a screenshot of the game, which looks quite decent. While there isn't a detailed overview of the program and the variables involved, it does mention in the notes that when you play the game you may be surprised at the speed with which the screen responds to your key press. This is achieved through a technique where the underground man is drawn 4 times at the start of the game in 4 different logical colours, and they're all set to the physical colour black so you can't see them. The proc key procedure then sets one of these to the colour green according to which key's been pressed, and because the object's already been drawn it appears almost instantaneously. It goes on to say this is all performed using the VDU19 call, and you can see below here in the listing the code that handles that. From line 1030 where it's checking for a key press, it then goes through a for loop cycling through 4 positions on the screen, switching them all to black, before checking which key's been pressed and switching the relevant part of the screen on. That's probably the most interesting part of the listing, though it does also have a procedure that randomly generates where the man that runs across the screen is going to appear from, and also a number of gcall and draw commands that show it's using graphical plotting routines as well as sprites in this game. The listing concludes on the following page, so you can see it only takes up 2 pages in total, not a very long listing. There's a couple of big data statements at the end there that'll test your copying abilities, but otherwise this is a pretty simple listing to type in, I'd say. And with that, let's take a look at the game. The game begins by showing some instructions which weren't in the listing in the mag, so somebody must have decided to add these when they typed it in. The first page just repeats the opening paragraph from the magazine, giving an overview of the game. That's then followed by a screen displaying the controls and asking you to enter a difficulty level. After doing that, the game begins, oddly displaying the word gently on the screen before drawing the layout. Little blue men will then randomly appear at one side of the screen, and you must move your character into the correct spot to allow them safe passage from one side to the other. Doing so will score you a point, while if you lose too many men, I think it's 9, the game will end. This is clearly inspired by the Nintendo Game & Watch game Manhole, but it's a lot more fast paced. It has graphics that are colourful and well drawn, especially the creature that holds the manhole cover, which I always thought looked Repton-esque. As is typical for basic games, the sounds are functional but unremarkable. It's a pretty simple twitch reaction game that is both addictive and stressful, and as it speeds up you end up making more mistakes out of panic and getting mixed up about which key to press. It's fairly easy to get a good score on difficulty level 1, but the third one is crazy fast. The game would benefit from letting you know how many fails you have left, and also displaying your score on screen and having a high score table. You could also add stages where you have to reach a target number of men saved in order to progress. Other changes that could enhance the game would be to have more than one person crossing at once, or maybe add an option that allows the men to jump the gaps but can only be used a limited number of times. Having said all that, this is still fun for a few tries and is pretty fast for a basic game, so even the listing as it stands would have been just about good enough, whilst also giving plenty of scope for enhancements. Time now to move on to the second magazine in this episode then, and this is the March/April edition of A&B Computing, still bi-monthly at this point. I'm not sure it ever went monthly, I guess I'll find out as I progress through this series. As you can see, this is A&B Computing for the users of the BBC Micro and Electron. We have seen one other issue of this so far in previous episodes, I think. Not much more to say about the cover. It's very plain, really. Very boring text alternating between blue and red. And it's got some hardware stacked up on the picture on the front cover. An Acorn Electron on top of a BBC Micro, on top of a printer, and also some random circuit boards. So that's enough for looking at the front cover. Let's jump inside. And the first article I'm going to look at is on page 40. And this is Turtle Talk. Come aboard as we set sail on a 2-part voyage into Turtle graphics programming. Now this is something I remember from when I was using a BBC Micro at school. They had this program where you could draw these interesting patterns using quite simplistic commands, so I thought we'd take a quick look at this. I don't think it's actually related to the turtles, which are the little sort of robots that you could control and move around on the floor, although maybe there is some correlation between them. I'm not going to read all this article to find out, but it does say that Turtle Talk is a subset of the language Logo invented by Seymour Papert, which allows the user by use of simple commands to instruct a cursor on the screen to draw graphic patterns and designs. And it goes on to say the beauty of the language is that the user can build up a library of his own routines which use the operating system commands and or other user-defined routines, and so create complex designs in a user-friendly and structured way. The BBC version allows plotting in modes 4 and 5 and makes good use of the graphic facilities available. The article then continues over the next 6 or 7 pages. It includes some program listings that can use the language, lots more screenshots of the various patterns and things that you can draw, an overview of all the commands in this language, which as you can see are quite simple, usually just 2 or 3 characters, including CL to clear screen, FD for forward, BD for backwards, RT for right, and unsurprisingly LT for left. I guess the most important one though is that you need to use PU and PD to put the pen up and down, and obviously putting it down is when you actually draw the lines on the screen. On the final page of the article there seems to be a large image of a boat which presumably was drawn using this program, and perhaps the program is detailed below because there is a very large basic program which incorporates the commands used in this language. Moving on to page 58, and this is another article about graphics, but this one ties in more with the one we just looked at in the Beeb magazine, because this one's talking about creating multicoloured sprites to use in machine code routines, but this time using mode 2 rather than the mode 5 that was covered in the Beeb one. Again, I'm not going to be going into any depth on this one, but it does look like a pretty decent article if you're interested in creating your own multicoloured graphics for machine code games, and it looks like it includes a program that allows you to design and implement them. Moving on to later in the magazine, page 104, and there's a number of reviews of educational software, and there's one in particular that stood out to me, and I'm sure it'll stand out to anyone who grew up using a BBC Micro at school. Yep, it's a review of the classic Granny's Garden, and you can see a number of screenshots from the game there at the top, but let's zoom in and take a look at what the reviewer had to say about it. Firstly, we can see it cost just £10, which is quite surprising for a piece of educational software that made it onto every BBC Micro in schools back in the 80s. It then gives a pretty extensive overview of the game and all the different sections before rounding things up in the final column by saying the program shows imaginative use of both sound and colour, and the Mode 7 graphics are particularly good. The difficulty of the problems is about right for the proposed age group. The reviewer's 5-year-old tester could only solve 1 out of 4. It's aimed at children aged 7 and upwards, by the way. It does go on to say the loading time of over 5 minutes is a drawback when you're working with young children, and it's advisable to have something else going on at this time. And it rounds off the review by saying, with suitable parental or teacher guidance, this program could be very useful in introducing the younger child to the logical solution of problems. It then gives some ratings, which is sound 75, graphics 80, documentation 80, value for money 75, and overall 75%. So a pretty solid review for this classic piece of educational software. Time to move on to the games listing for this magazine then, and it's Earth Battle. Battle it out in 3D with the invading alien force. Earth is doomed, but the human race may yet survive. Pretty dramatic. There's also an image of a random giant spacecraft being blown up, and also a screenshot from the game as well of sorts. You can see a star-filled background and, well, a little sort of triangular shape with a square cap on the top of it. I'm going to assume that's an alien spacecraft at this point. The introduction says Earth Battle is a relatively short 4K program designed on a BBC Model B, using Mode 2 graphics. The program is a space game with a slight variation from the rest. It then goes on to give a backstory for the game, which we'll skip past because I'm sure that's going to be included in the instructions when I look at it. It then goes on to give a pretty comprehensive overview of how the program fits together, including all the procedures used, such as proc instructions, proc mountains, proc stars, proc SA, whatever that is, proc alien, proc move, and proc display. Of course, I could have found out what proc SA does by reading what it says underneath it, so I will do. It says this routine generates the position of a new alien and reinitializes the necessary variables. Speaking of variables, on the following page it gives you an overview of all the variables used within the game, and then goes on to describe program features, which is everything from what mode it runs in, to VDU commands, to the various basic commands used in the program. And finally, it also gives an overview of the program structure, giving detailed information about what happens on almost every line. The program itself takes up just a page and a half, with about 150 lines, the last 10 of which is just for the instructions, so it's going to be a pretty simple program to type in. The one thing I picked out that I thought was worth a closer look is that on lines 1160 to 1230 it produces 100 randomly placed stars on the screen. So just to take a closer look at that particular routine, that's proc stars. We can see a G-call command and then a for loop from 1 to 100, unsurprisingly, and then random numbers generated for the coordinates on the screen, where it then draws a point using the move and draw commands. Aside from that, I didn't spot anything particularly interesting in the listing, so let's move on now and take a look at the game. As we become accustomed to, the game begins with some instructions, very simply presented in white text on a black background, and it says you're the last line of defence for Earth. You cannot save the planet, but you can give the survivors enough time to enable them to escape. You yourself cannot survive, but while your shields and fuel last, you can still destroy the aliens. For every 5 aliens you destroy, your shields will be partly replenished. A cross is marked on the screen where your guns are aiming at, and to alter its position, use the cursor keys. To fire, use the spacebar, and it strangely says a direct hit is sometimes not necessary in order to destroy an alien. Pressing any key starts the game, and you're greeted initially with a star field being drawn on the screen by that routine I was just looking at, followed by a set of mountains at the bottom and a status bar at the top, which shows your remaining fuel and shield and the elapsed time in the game. Your aiming crosshairs is then displayed on the screen. You must move it around and shoot the aliens as quickly as possible. Every time you fire a laser, your fuel's depleted, and the longer an alien stays on screen, the more of your shield it'll drain. Destroying an alien results in a nice explosion, and then the whole sequence is repeated again. Effectively, you're just doing the same thing over and over, shooting one alien at a time until your inevitable demise when your shields run out. This is a relatively simple gallery shooter, but it has good graphics, using the Beeb's graphical plotting commands for almost all of the game. This is faster than moving sprites around, which means that the movement of your crosshairs and the alien ship is relatively smooth for a basic game, though it inevitably slows down a bit when firing. The enemy craft is not very attractive, but the way it resizes itself as it moves around the screen is clever. Sounds are limited to a pretty pathetic noise when your lasers fire, and a slightly better explosion sound when you destroy an alien ship. Speaking of which, the graphical effect when this happens is pretty large and impressive. Your score is based on how long a time you last in the game, which is quite an original way of doing things. There's also some mild strategy involved, as you need to try and hit the enemies as quickly as possible so they don't drain your shield, without being too trigger happy, as this costs you fuel. The biggest problem with the game as it stands is that the BBC's 2x2 arrangement of the cursor keys is not helpful in controlling the crosshairs, which frequently results in moving it the wrong direction. It would also be better if there was a target number of ships to hit, or some way of progressing to a new level with different landscapes or aliens. It mentioned in the magazine that this is only a 4K listing, so there is lots of room and memory for improvement, but this is still fairly playable as is, as long as you change the keys by following the guidelines that are given in the magazine. Time to move on to the next magazine then, and this is the first time this magazine has been featured in this series. It's Personal Computer News, issue number 57, cover date is April the 14th, 1984, As you can see, this is a weekly magazine. It has a cover price of 50p, and this edition's got 84 pages. And I'd say this has got a pretty attractive cover. There's lots of colour on there. There's a very big picture of the micro key, which apparently is the computer PCN readers helped to design. And it says on the screen there, fourth based with dozens of colours available, full PCN Pro Test inside. I don't really think they thought that through very well, because it does say Pro Test, but it looks like protest, which would suggest that they're complaining about it rather than praising it. Aside from that, there's some boxes indicating some of the other stuff in the magazine, and the one I'm most interested in, of course, is a BBC build-up in a programme to get you steamed up, and we'll get into exactly what that means in a few minutes. Let's take a look inside then. The first thing I'm going to focus on is on page 4, which is a news item entitled Games Prices Crash. And if you've followed my channel for a number of years, you'll know exactly why I'm interested in this one, because it says here games prices are hitting the floor as the day of pocket money software dawns. As of last week, Pulsonic is selling Commodore and Sinclair games for $2.99, and a new company, Mastertronic, is going even lower at $1.99. So yeah, this is a news article that indicates the beginning of the budget games era, and there are a number of comments from different people in the industry about this. Pulsonic's Richard Bailey admitted, "I don't pretend that our games are up to the standard of The Hobbit, but Mastertronic aims to ensure a flow of top quality products by selling the software of established software houses. Even so, it declined to name its suppliers." However, it says the development of a new bargain basement hasn't thrown the industry's big names into ferment. Virgin Games' Nick Alexander saying it sounds reasonable, budget albums exist quite happily alongside full price albums. It notes that these new budget companies seem to be focusing on the most popular micros of the time, with 9 of Mastertronic's first 12 titles being for the Spectrum, with the rest split between the Commodore 64 and VIC-20. Having said that, Alan Sharam of Mastertronic mentions that the company has a Dragon game in the works and they'll be looking at other systems as well. So a nice little article there. It was particularly of interest to me because I'm a big fan of budget games, as you'll know from watching my channel over the years. Moving on a few pages then, let's take a look at the PCN charts for April 1984, which not only has a list of the top 30 games, but also the top 10 micros in the under and over £1,000 category. In terms of the games, let's just take a look at the top 10, and I have to say there's not a lot here that stands out for me. Straight in at number 1 was Jet Set Willy, which displays Digital Integration's Fighter Pilot, with Checkered Flag, Manic Miner and Bugaboo the Flea making up the top 5. I'm not a fan of Manic Miner or Jet Set Willy, so I wouldn't have been spending my money on those. The rest of the top 10's made up of Hunchback, Attic Attack, Chinese Juggler, 3D Ant Attack and Flight. It's very Spectrum heavy at this point in time, which probably makes sense when you consider how popular the system had become in homes across the UK due to its relatively low price point. The one thing that did stand out to me though was the price of all these games. None of these cost more than £8 each, which I was a little bit surprised by because I thought most games retailed around the £10 price point. The one that really stood out to me was Ultimate's Attic Attack, which only cost £5.50 and is easily the best of the bunch in the top 10. Moving down to look at the top 10 micros in the under £1,000 category, because let's be honest, those are the ones most people would be interested in. There's no real surprises here. Jumping up to number 1 from third place is the Commodore 64, well on its way to becoming the biggest selling micro of the era. That's followed by the Spectrum, and in third place is the BBC Micro, which is exactly what you'd expect for 1984. These were the 3 biggest selling home computers in the UK until Amstrad's CPC 464 hit the market. As for the systems that cost over £1,000, there's some well-known systems in that top 10, including the IBM PC and Apple III, but there's also some more unusual and soon forgotten business systems such as the DEC Rainbow 100, the Wang Professional and the Televideo TS1603. Speaking of computer systems that didn't last long in the memory, I've now moved on to page 62 in this 2-page spread advertising the Spectravideo range of computers. On the left we've got the SV318, which includes a built-in joystick, and on the right the SV328, which looks like more of a business orientated machine with its proper keyboard and separate numeric keypad. The thing that really stood out about this advert, apart from the 2 machines, is this quote at the top which states that the systems leave the Atari, Dragon, Commodore 64 and Lynx for dead, which is attributed to Which Micro from December 1983. You probably wouldn't get much argument about it outclassing the Dragon or the Lynx, but to say it's better than the C64 or Atari 8-bits was a very bold claim. I don't know anyone that had a Spectravideo computer back in the 80s. If you did and you've got anything to say about it, good or bad, then leave a comment and let me know. With that, let's jump just one page back for the featured game from this magazine. This is Trainiac, obviously for the BBC, and to be fair, the presentation of this is pretty nice with a full colour page featuring a screenshot, a nice logo for the game, and even a drawing of a Wild West train chugging along. The overview says Trainiac is an exciting game of speed and manual dexterity from Simon Williams of Beworthy in Devon. Instead of controlling the usual angrily animated aliens and hyper-electric laser booster shooters, you play the part of a railroad company's bridge-building chief engineer. Your assignment is to repair damage to the railway line before the oncoming express is derailed. Each level of the game consists of 4 screens, and by moving a bridge-shaped cursor around the screen and using it to lay down new sections of bridge, gaps in the line may be closed so that the train can pass safely. If the train successfully completes its journey, you receive a bonus and move on to the next level, where the train thunders across the prairies and deserts at yet greater speed. So an interesting sounding concept for the game, and the screenshot looks pretty decent as well. So let's have a look at the listing now, and one thing that really stands out is just how big the text is on this one. You're certainly not likely to make too many mistakes with how large and clear the listing is. Interestingly, it appears based on the REM statements that this game's been around for a couple of years already because the copyright was from 1982. In addition to the listing, you also get an overview of what each section of code does with quite a bit of detail. The listing continues over another 3 pages, but because of the size of that text, it actually uses about 160 lines. Most of it's the usual stuff we've seen in many of the basic listings up to this point, with plenty of use of procedures and the like, but the one thing that did seem quite interesting is proc tune, which, as the notes say, plays the start and finish tunes from the note data held in the data statements. If we look at that a little bit more closely, we can see it takes in a couple of parameters, one of which is a pointer, which it immediately restores. It then reads in a number of notes that was specified in the parameter passed in, reading 3 values from the data statements into frequency, duration and rest, which it then passes into 2 sound commands to play the music. That's quite a clever little routine, which I don't think we've seen before in any of the other listings. I feel this magazine made a really good effort to try and make the listing easy to type in and understand, as well as being quite pleasing to look at on the page. The question is though, is the game any good? And the only way to find that out is to take a look at it. As is usually the case, we begin with some instructions, but the way these are drawn on the screen is pretty cool, with the train chugging along one line at a time, dropping the words behind it. They also give a bit more backstory to the game than was printed in the magazine, saying an agent for the stagecoach company known as the Trainiac has been systematically trying to break the Tombstone and Carson City Railroad Company by sabotaging the main line. Your job is to bridge the gaps left by Trainiac's bombs, and if a train gets through to Carson City, another leaves Tombstone faster than before. The faster the train, the more money you earn for saving it. It finishes off by giving you the controls, which are the BBC Micro standard, and its spacebar to place the bridges. You then press space to begin the game and you're shown 4 layers of landscape that the train's going to traverse across from left to right. A neat rendition of the Runaway Train tune plays and then the game begins, and you must move your cursor pretty quickly to plug up the gaps in each level with bridge sections. If the train makes it across all the sections, then it'll move on to another screen where you must repeat the process, and so on until it reaches the station at Carson City. You'll then receive a cash bonus and the whole sequence begins again, with the train moving a little bit faster each cycle. With the train constantly moving, this is a frantic reaction and keyboard precision test, as any lapse in concentration will cause the train to crash and a life to be lost. The graphics are colourful and well designed, the chugging sound of the train is spot on, and the little tunes that play at the start and end of each stage are well beyond what you'd get in most basic games. The random placement and size of the gaps makes for a fresh challenge each game, and the difficulty curve is pretty fair, though eventually the train does get too fast to keep up with. It would be more fun if new hazards were added, or maybe if the train went back the opposite way and the bridges were out again, but even as it stands, this is an enjoyable if slightly repetitive game. The programme is well designed and relatively short, so certainly would have been worth typing in at the time, and I thought that procedure for generating the tunes was especially clever. For the final magazine and game of this episode, I'm going full circle back to Beeb magazine and the April 1984 edition. This time I decided to do the front cover in a very fetching shade of brown rather than the yellow of the previous edition, and you can see a couple of games mentioned on the front cover, the dartboard game, which I'm not going to be looking at, and also Elevation, which I am. There's also some very impressive 3D bar charts shown on the front cover. Moving inside the magazine, the first thing I want to take a look at is on page 8, and this is an overview of Acorn's teletext adapter, which it says here costs £225 including VAT and consists of a box half the size of the Beeb which sits alongside it and is connected by a 34-way ribbon cable to the Micro's 1MHz bus. There's also the teletext filing system, which comes with an EEPROM to be fitted into the vacant sideways ROM socket, and the unit is self-powered and a comprehensive manual and function key label are also supplied. For setting it up, it says once the teletext file system is installed and the unit set up, a TV aerial needs to be connected to the coaxial socket at the back of the teletext adapter and the unit then switched on. The article then goes on to tell you how to tune in the adapter to the 4 terrestrial TV channels of the time, and that typing star teletext effectively turns your micro into a versatile teletext receiver. So effectively you could look at this as a fairly primitive early internet browser, although you're browsing pages over a TV signal rather than downloading them using a modem. One interesting aspect of this device is that you could use the adapter to download programs from the BBC's CFAX service onto your micro, and it says at present up to 150k of software is available. The end of the review questions the value for money for the device, and it says that so far it's difficult to claim that it's good value for money. At £225 it's clearly overpriced, though it is technically advanced and there are no further costs involved, unlike using Prestel. Tuning the unit is very sensitive, and the red tuning wheels require only the most minute movement to go from on tune to off tune, and this can be very frustrating. It does however say that the downloading of programs is exceptional, and it's to be hoped that the high standard of programs broadcast will be maintained. So it certainly looks like a pretty interesting, if luxury, device for its time. Not something I ever encountered, but if you had any experience with the BBC's teletext adapter when you were a kid, or even now, then let me know in the comments. Moving on to page 22, and there's a couple of 4-star game reviews. Certainly one game that I'd give 4 stars is Chucky Egg. There's not a huge review of this, and it mostly just covers how to play it, but it does say at the end, the game gets increasingly harder as you progress through different levels, and the graphics, although perhaps a little simple, are quite pleasing, as are the sound effects. The other game reviewed is Zalaga from Aardvark Software. That's the clone of the arcade game Galaga, and again it says this is a superb game, probably the best game of its genre with the inevitable exclusion of Acornsoft's Planetoid. Planetoid, if you didn't know, is a clone of Defender, so I'd actually disagree with this statement because I'd much rather play a clone of Galaga than a clone of Defender. Moving on a few pages, there's a continuation of the Machine Code graphics series that was featured in the previous edition. This is part 3 and covers Mode 2 graphics, which it says is the most used mode when it comes to arcade games, probably because it offers the greatest number of colours at one time. Just as in the previous articles we've seen in this episode, in both Bebug and A&B Computing, it gives a good overview of how to create the graphics and set different colours, and also gives you a couple of programs to test out your multicoloured graphics and machine code routines. And finally, before looking at the games listing, just to jump to the inside back cover, you can see that this magazine has a cassette offer, much like the Micro User and other magazines have done. If you can't be bothered to type in all the listings from the magazine, you can send off for a cassette that includes them all, and in this case the cassettes cost £3, or you can even subscribe and get them all. Moving on to the games listing from this magazine then, and it's Elevasion, as I already mentioned, which from this very murky screenshot appears to be some kind of platformer. It's got a very extensive overview of the game, which I'm going to skip over because the instructions will cover that when we look at the game itself. But it does say in the final paragraph, this is an outstanding game, particularly for one written in BASIC. We've tried to keep the length of the program as reasonable as possible, and hence the program listed does not display any of the instructions on the screen after the initial title page. The version of Elevation on this month's magazine cassette, which I've just been talking about, is the full version, which includes 2 additional screen pages showing the instructions described above. Now the version I'm going to be looking at is that version, which is why I'm skipping over the rest of this introduction. In terms of the listing itself, as they say, it's a pretty big listing. This one covers 4 pages with over 400 lines of code, but having skimmed through it, there's nothing particularly interesting about it. It's the usual standard stuff you get for basic listings. We've got lots of characters being defined with VDU23 commands. We've got sound envelopes, we've got concatenated strings making up the sprites for the game, a high score table, and the whole game runs through a sequence of procedures. The one noteworthy thing right at the very end of the listing is it says if you find the game too fast for you, it can be slowed down by inserting a delay at line 2385, and you'll see why I've pointed that out when we look at the game now. As I mentioned, the version I'm looking at here seems to be the cassette version that you'd mail away for, and the instructions say your man is in a maze of lifts. The aim of the game is to destroy the droids which inhabit it. To do this, you must lure them under one of the red mines. When a droid passes under one of these, it is temporarily disabled and can be destroyed by the man passing under it. If a droid catches the man, it explodes. If the man passes under a mine, he's temporarily stopped, and after 5 games, blue cloners appear. If a droid passes under one of these, 2 will emerge. The following page mentions that you're able to wrap around the screen on the left and right hand side. It also mentions the controls, which is Z and X to move left and right, and the asterisk and question mark to control the direction of the lifts when you're in one. Return starts the game and you're presented with a randomly generated network of lifts and platforms with your character at the top left hand side. Initially starting with just one enemy, the robots will immediately try and home in on your position by traversing the platforms and lifts. What you must do to try and trap them is position yourself on the opposite side of one of the red mines to the robot and lure it beneath it. You can then pass under the trapped robot to eliminate it, and when all robots on the screen have been eliminated, you move on to the next stage. As the instructions mention, passing under the mines yourself will stun you, and it won't take the robots long to home in on your position. Stunned robots will also release themselves after a certain amount of time. Upon completing a level or losing a life, you're presented with a colourful status screen which shows your score, number of droids destroyed, and men remaining. In terms of how it looks and sounds, this is a pretty run-of-the-mill game. The Mode 2 graphics are just okay, and the sounds are mostly just annoying bleeps. Moving to your player character is reasonably responsive, but the lifts move so fast it's hard to get on or off at the right place, and the enemy robots home in on you really quickly, so you have to take action as soon as a level begins or they'll get you before you can trap them. The game seems quite glitchy as it seems to advance levels when you lose a life, and the number of monsters per stage can vary each time you play. Progress is very reliant on the random placement of lifts and traps being in your favour, with some games seeming impossible while others are more straightforward. The game is really hard and frustrating, yet I played it loads of times and did start to make progress, so it does have something about it. It's a fairly original idea but needs tweaking to make it a little easier, at least to begin with. Slowing the game down as suggested in the magazine will be one quick fix, but maybe having a button to reverse the lifts or just being able to jump or more easily avoid the robots would make for a more enjoyable experience. Given this was over 400 lines of code, I'm not sure I would have been happy with the resulting game, but as I said, there was something about it, so maybe with a few tweaks it would have been worth the effort. That brings this edition of the history of BBC Micro typing games to an end, and that was another mixed bag of games listings. The overall quality certainly didn't match the 1984 games from the previous episode, but there were still some interesting concepts, even if the games themselves lacked depth for the most part. The best two games for me this time were the ones that required lightning fast reactions, with both Trainiac and the Manhole game really testing your reflexes, despite being quite simple and repetitive in principle. If you enjoyed this video, then please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment with any thoughts you have about the games or magazines covered. You can also check out the pinned comment for links to the games and mags featured in this episode. For the next edition of this series I have something a little different in mind, which I'll keep to myself for now, but that'll be released in about a month's time. Until then, please keep your eye on this channel for a variety of retro gaming content, and thanks very much for watching.